Today we're going to talk about periodization. So really in a nutshell, what is periodization? Periodization, very simply put, is planning. So that can run over various time frames. When we're working in elite sport, preparing for things like the Olympic Games, that can run over as much as 4 years. And there will be planning or different phases of training that will be seasonal and will be refined as we get into those Olympic cycles. But for the average runner that's looking to improve and get better, periodization essentially will revolve around how do we plan and set up our training for a specific event. And it may be that we do an event every year, and then we'll be able to refine that planning as we go along.
Okay, now that you guys know what periodization is, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail as to why it's important for running. So essentially, when you're doing a running program and training really hard, you don't want to be doing the same thing every single day and every single week, because your body is going to adapt to that and never land up improving, and you'll find that you'll just plateau over time. And so we want to create variety and building blocks so that we can start improving over time. So think of that exactly that way, as building blocks. So if you have a training block, a 4-week training block as an example, and we build those blocks up, it is also absolutely pivotal to have a recovery week in there, because as we've learned, we really get all the adaptation that we need in those recovery weeks. So a nice example of how this would work within a monthly cycle almost, or a block of training, is very often training plans are built on a 4-week cycle. What that means is there's a loading plan of perhaps 3 weeks and a deloading week or a recovery week in the 4th week, which allows for that adaptation to really take place. And so that process will continue over an entire quarterly process, and then even in a year. What's really important to consider with this periodization plan then over a year's sort of plan is that you're not doing the same thing all the time. There may be times within that periodization where you are focusing on strength as an example, and that you would normally probably do coming out of your off season as you're starting your new yearly block or new plan, and then from there you can move that into a little bit more specific work around your running, and then tapering off a little bit more on the strength as you're getting closer to your race day.
The basics of periodization really are that we have meso and microcycles. Mesocycles being bigger, and those would be essentially phases of training. So laying the foundation, building the platform, aerobic training will be names that you will be familiar with, and those are typically the beginning periods of a planning session. And how long these mesocycles are is really dependent on how much time you give yourself to plan for a specific event. Typically they will be in the region of 4 to 8 weeks. The more time you give yourself, the longer I would make that preparation base aerobic phase of training, and I really try to get to 8 weeks. The more consistent your training has been, in other words, the fewer breaks you've had to take, or if you're one of those people who takes or doesn't take a long break through the winter, the shorter that period will probably need to be, because you will have laid a lot of the foundation. But during this phase you might focus on strength a little bit, but you will definitely be keeping most of your runs really easy. Then the rest of those periods will be largely determined by the type of event that you're training for. Are we training for 5,000 or 5 kilometers, 10Ks, half marathon, marathon and beyond? But each of those periods of between 4 to 6 weeks will compromise a specific area that you are working on. And those will vary from coach to coach, but what I like to do is go from a general preparation phase where we worked on physical strength, sort of in a gym, into a period where we work on specific run strength using typically hills and different durations of hills as we move through that period of 4 to 6 weeks. And the rest of my cycles are then typically in the 4-week range, where we'll move into speed endurance, speed, and then sharpening up.
So now let's look at periodization on a weekly level and how to structure your week. So periodization, when we refer to in the week specifically, so really coming down to the nuts and bolts of what your running week or your training week would look like, it is important first and foremost to make sure that we think about recovery. We often forget about that, so we generally look to go with at least one recovery or rest day, so preferably a day off completely. And then what you want to really do is try and structure your week where around 80 to 85% of your weekly volume is actually your easy runs or your long runs. So that's where we really start focusing on your aerobic system, maintaining your aerobic system as well as building it. And then about 15 to 20% of your weekly volume will actually be your quality runs or your high intensity interval work. With that though as well, is it is important to try and space in the strength training. So we're obviously big advocates for the strength side of things to complement your running. So how do we put that all together is often where it becomes a little bit tricky. There's only so many days in a week. So it is important to try and do, we space our programs where your strength training, if you've got a lighter strength training session, we would put that on the same day as a lighter run. So trying to obviously get the strength sessions and the runs to talk to each other and to work well together. You want to make sure that you're also not putting intensity strength work, so high intensity interval strength work on days where you're also doing high intensity run sessions. So it is important to try and just get the balance of your recovery, making sure that you're doing some recovery runs in between, not running every single day, which is quite important. You want to give, preferably where possible, you want to try and give at least a day between your runs. And then if you're doing strength training, your heavier strength training, make sure it is before or a day before your heavy quality interval run session and not on the same day. That obviously is going to just affect the quality of how you actually do that in interval running session itself.
One of the things in periodization that a lot of people get wrong is the taper, the final phase or last 10 days to 2 weeks as we move into a big event. And that is largely driven by two factors, and that is that most of us react quite differently to really reducing the training load, and the other side is fear, is that we feel like we are losing fitness if we back off from the training too far away from an event. The longer the event that you're preparing for, the earlier we need to start reducing the training volume. So if you're training for ultras, that typically needs to then extend a little bit into the 3-week range. If we're training for much shorter events, that'll go into the 7, 10, 14-day range. Some people respond extremely well to doing almost nothing in the final week, and some people find that A, extremely stressful, and number two, their body almost starts to shut down, and so when they get to race day, feel very flat, and it takes you a long time to get into the race. Again, the longer the race you are preparing for, the more that is okay. Because if you're not feeling amazing at the start of the run, you can use the first 30 to 40 to 60 minutes to actually just let your body get into it, and freshness is going to win out at the end of the day. But typically I like to use a recovery approach that starts to prepare my runners for what the taper week's going to be like. So every recovery week, which will be between every 3 to 4 weeks, again it'll depend a little bit on your own mesocycles and what you respond well to, use those recovery weeks as opportunities to figure out if you respond very well to doing very little, and you'll know because by the end of the week you'll start to feel very good, or at the end of the week you'll start to feel very bad. And if you feel very bad towards the end of the week of doing very little, you still want to reduce in that last week, but you won't reduce to doing almost nothing. Thanks for checking in. If you enjoyed the video, click on the like button, and don't forget to check out some of our videos that are on screen now.